Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive straight into the engine room of the global economy, the Federal Reserve. We're going to unpack the really intense debate over the Fed's unprecedented monetary policies. We'll be looking at Christopher Leonard's sharp criticisms on one side, and then contrasting them with a staunch economic rebuttal from William Poole. We are talking about decisions made behind closed doors that literally affect everything from the price of your groceries to the stability of the entire global financial system.
So let's kick things off with a bit of a thought experiment. Imagine for a second, what actually happens when a machine creates trillions of dollars completely out of thin air? That's the mind-bending reality of the Fed. The dollar in your pocket is essentially a Fed Reserve note, and the Fed is the only institution on the planet that can just will new US dollars into existence. But, as we're going to see, having that kind of superpower is a massive double-edged sword. To unpack all of this, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. First, the infinite money machine. Second, how QE broke the economy. Third, the lone Fed dissenter. Fourth, an economist strikes back. Fifth, the missing reverse gear. And finally, the unavoidable trap.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the infinite money machine.
Before we go any further, we really need to demystify this term, quantitative easing, or QE. Now, traditionally, the Fed manages the economy just by tweaking interest rates. But during the 2008 crash, they pushed those rates all the way down to zero, and the economy was still completely sluggish. Enter QE. Instead of just lowering rates, the Fed literally conjured up brand new money and used it to buy massive quantities of government bonds, injecting cash directly into the financial system.
And paired right alongside QE was ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. The goal here was to make borrowing basically free. The entire theory was that if banks are sitting on massive mountains of cash and borrowing costs are at zero, well, they'd have absolutely no choice but to lend that money out to Main Street. In theory, that spurs investment, creates jobs, and gets the economy roaring again.
Now check out this number, 52,000%. It's honestly hard to wrap your head around. That is the staggering spike in excess money sitting in the banking system between 2008 and 2010 alone. To really put that into perspective for you, before 2008, it would have taken roughly 60 years to add the amount of dollars the Fed just injected in a few short months. They completely flooded the zone.
Which brings us to Section 2, how QE broke the economy, focusing on Christopher Leonard's core arguments.
Investigative journalist Christopher Leonard argues that this whole QE experiment wasn't just some harmless technical tweak. He says it was dangerous, ineffective, and fundamentally broke the economy. He breaks the fallout down into three major failures: asset price inflation, keeping zombie companies alive, and a massive widening of wealth inequality. Let's look at his first failure, what we can call the Great Distortion. Think about it. When your safe savings account pays you absolutely 0% interest, what do? You're basically forced to look for riskier places to put your cash just to get any kind of return. This dynamic pushed a massive, unprecedented tidal wave of cash straight into stocks and real estate. It drove prices sky high, which obviously enriched the people who already own those assets, while leaving your average wage-earning worker completely in the dust. Moving on to failure number 2, zombie companies. In a normal, healthy economy, companies that take on way too much debt and can't turn a profit eventually go bankrupt. It's a harsh but totally necessary process of creative destruction. But Leonard points out that with interest rates pegged at zero, these dying companies could just endlessly roll over their cheap debt. They stayed on life support like zombies, misallocating capital and dragging down overall economic productivity.
And then we have failure 3, widening inequality. This newly printed money didn't magically appear in everyday workers' wallets. Because of how the system works, it went straight into the banking sector and to large corporations, who mostly used it for things like stock buybacks and Wall Street speculation. So, according to Leonard's analysis, this directly widened the gap between the rich and the poor. Wall Street boomed, while Main Street was stuck dealing with stagnant wages.
Now let's pivot a bit to Section 3, the lone Fed dissenter.
It's fascinating because there was actually intense pushback inside the Fed itself. Back in 2010, Thomas Hoenig, who was the president of the Kansas City Fed, kept voting against this easy money consensus. While almost everyone else in that windowless conference room saw QE as a necessary emergency lever, Hoenig voted no at every single meeting. He practically begged them to maintain discipline, warning that flooding the system like this would create moral hazard and let inflation totally unanchor over the long term.
But there's a powerful counterargument here. Let's look at Section 4, an economist strikes back.
Enter William Poole. He's also a former Federal Reserve Bank president. In fact, he sat at the exact same table as Thomas Hoenig for years. Reviewing Leonard's book for an economics journal, Poole comes out swinging. He argues that Leonard fundamentally misunderstands how macroeconomics actually works. Poole says Leonard is totally confusing the painful side effects of monetary policy with its actual intended goals.
Poole goes right for Leonard's foundational assumptions about the 2008 crisis itself. He points to research by Peter Wallison, arguing that the crash wasn't actually driven by Fed policy. Instead, he blames government housing regulations, specifically HUD rules, that forced entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy up weak subprime mortgages. Poole's overarching point here? Leonard is blaming the Fed for trying to fix a massive structural collapse that they didn't even cause in the first place.
This leads us perfectly into Section 5, the missing reverse gear.
To really hammer home his biggest critique of Leonard's logic, Poole tells this incredible story. I want you to imagine a massive 900-foot tanker ship. It's heavily loaded, entering the extremely shallow Delaware Bay, and it has to run at absolute top speed just to reach the dock while the tide is still high. But here's the kicker, and it's honestly terrifying. Once they're underway, the captain turns to the harbor pilot and drops this bombshell. The ship has no functioning reverse gear. It literally cannot stop using its own engines. It would need miles to coast to a halt or an entire fleet of tugboats to catch it before it crashes. Poole uses that runaway ship to brilliantly illustrate a golden rule in macroeconomics. You have to have at least as many tools or instruments as you have goals. The ship needed a reverse gear to safely dock. The Fed, Poole argues, basically only has one steering wheel, and that is the short-term interest rate. Yet they're juggling employment, prices, and financial stability. You simply cannot use an interest rate tweak to solve deep societal wealth inequality. Expecting the Fed to do that is like trying to stop that tanker without a reverse gear. It's structurally impossible. Let's wrap things up with Section 6, the unavoidable trap.
Even with their massive disagreements on the mechanics, both sides basically agree on this terrifying psychological arc. What started in 2008 as a temporary fix turned into a full-blown addiction to cheap money. By 2015 to 2019, anytime the Fed tried to raise rates and pull money out, the markets would practically throw a tantrum and crash. Then 2020 hit, the Fed panicked and printed practically 300 years' worth of money in 2 months, and boom, we arrive at the explosive inflation reckoning we are dealing with right now.
So whether you buy into Leonard's warnings about wealth inequality or you side with Poole's technical arguments about inflation and instruments, they both agree on one very scary reality. Relying purely on the Fed as a fix-all for our economic problems has built a deeply, deeply fragile house of cards. Manipulating the money supply has massive side effects that we just might not be able to control.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling question. When that house of cards inevitably falls, who is actually going to pay the price? The system is completely flooded, inflation is a daily reality, and the easy exits are long gone, my friends. Understanding exactly how we got into this mess is crucial, but navigating what comes next, that's a challenge that is going to affect every single one of us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.